Hi everyone, welcome to this session which is all around 2 years worth of lessons learnt from online assessment centres. I think the talk is originally positioned as 12 months worth of lessons, but obviously it's practically been another year since I submitted the presentation title, so we've got another 12 months for free as a special bonus. My name is Ben Williams. I am the founder and managing director of a firm called Sten10. So we specialise in the design of bespoke assessments, whether those are psychometrics or assessment centres themselves, and we offer the associated training and competency design that goes with that. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So after this short introduction, I'll paint the picture as to how assessment centres used to be run before everything changed. And then I'll talk through some ways in which organisations thought about responding to these challenges, because there were a whole array of options, and I'm going to talk to you about examples of each of those today. A lot of people were hesitant about going virtual. I know that assessment centres, or the option to run these types of simulations online, have been possible for a number of years now, but I'd say it was a fairly slow take-up. But then what we saw after the pandemic is a cliff edge rise. But there were concerns, and I'll talk about 4 key concerns with you. Then I'll do a bit of a retrospective look at what organisations say after 2 years of running virtual assessment centres are some of the benefits they've realised to date, but also some of the drawbacks that they've seen. And as a result, we can draw out some top tips. And there's lots of top tips, as you might expect, from going through this process, but these will relate to the technology that's employed in delivering these virtual centres, tips to help candidates shine and to do their best at a virtual assessment centre, tips to help the assessors feel sufficiently briefed and feel confident and motivated enough to do a great job at the centres, and then finally talk about content design, so the content of the centres themselves, how do you get those spot on. Then, with one eye on the future, what comes next? So are virtual assessment centres here to stay, or will we see a return to the days of on-site assessment? And we'll finish up with a free resource for everyone that will be accessible for you. I guess let's begin by talking about before the world changed. Cue lightning strike. So before the world changed, assessment centres, in my experience, were 90 to 100% on-site interactions in person. They'd be held either at the company's offices, and you'd be trying to find some rooms that were free and weren't booked and hold it there, or you'd hold it at some kind of rented office space. You could have up to well, many people at an assessment centre at a time, but maybe 30 people. So it was a busy, active environment. There was a lot of paper involved, paper for the assessors, paper for the candidates, paper for the wash-up session. And all of a sudden, lockdown and the pandemic came, and in-person events were no longer possible. How on earth do we respond? And obviously, this is a challenge for our clients, but it was a challenge for Sten10 as a company as well. We'd used some online behavioural assessments, but we weren't highly experienced in running online assessment centres, so it was incumbent upon us to learn about the different options available and to evaluate them for our clients and go on this journey with them. So, how to respond? So what options were available to people? Well, you could say, we're not doing recruitment again until face-to-face is possible. It's too much of a risk to move from face-to-face to online. There's not enough research around it, so let's just stop recruitment. That sounds potentially plausible in theory, seeing as the pandemic had meant a lot of recruitment was on hold. But in fairly short order, we saw recruitment levels start to rise again until now. at recent events I've been to. So a couple of weeks ago at the In-House Recruiters exhibition, they were talking about the war for talent, again, that old term, and the fact that it's really a candidates market and firms are desperately trying to recruit again. So that was not a long-term strategy. You could say, let's forget the assessment centre. Let's only use tests and interviews. Trying to move an assessment centre online is too complicated. The issue with that is that there are so many benefits from an assessment centre. Many people on this session will know that assessment centres are amongst the most predictive assessment tools in a recruitment setting or in a development setting. And it has other benefits in terms of informing people about the role that they'll be joining, allowing them to meet people who are currently in the job, etc. So some firms decided on that, but an alternative was preferable. Okay, so there was this third option, which I haven't actually heard of anyone doing, but if your organisation was large enough and you did sufficient numbers of assessment centres, you could have decided to build your own virtual assessment centre platform from scratch. This is a highly complicated task. Anyone that's put together an assessment centre timetable by hand using Excel will know how complicated the logistics are behind running an assessment centre, and to try to move all of that online along with video capability, scoring capability, it's a pretty gargantuan task. So no one really grabbed that particular nettle by the thorns. One thing I did see is people using their own existing platforms in-house to host assessment centre content. So maybe they had an e-learning platform that they thought, well, we could present some materials to people that way. Maybe we've got some kind of intranet that we could use to deliver content to people via, but it wasn't purpose-built. So that is one option. It's obviously, it's compatible. There's relatively reduced cost. So that's definitely some positives there. The next option is to say, well, let's not use our own existing technologies, but let's use stuff that's out there in the market. So let's use Zoom, let's use Google Docs, let's use Dropbox, let's email people things. So piece together different technologies to get a virtual assessment centre experience, which again, that was probably one of the most common approaches. Or finally, you could purchase an off-the-shelf assessment centre platform. So one that was purpose-built for assessment centre delivery. At the time of the pandemic, there wasn't much choice here. There were probably 3 to 4 platforms that you could choose between. And since the pandemic, I think we've seen a real explosion of these and more options available. So again, that's one of the more popular options. Okay, so I've talked about this being 2 years worth of lessons. So lessons learned by who? Is this lessons learned by us? Well, it is, but it's also lessons learned by a whole host of organisations. So the majority of these clients Sten10 have actually worked with, but some of them I've drawn from other sources of information, like a Corn Ferry report, which was entitled Equally Robust, Virtual versus In-Person Simulation Assessments. And there was also an Institute of Student Employers survey of graduate recruiters that talked about employer learnings from virtual assessment centres. So this is really a greatest hits of insights from a whole range of organisations of different sizes and different areas of focus. So that's where the data is being drawn from. Let's start by looking at some of the reasons why people were trepidatious, is that a word? Trepidatious about running a virtual assessment centre. So the first one that people reported is, how do we go about educating people about our culture and helping them to learn about what it's like to work here and also to entice them to work here? you might have seen that Rentokil, the pest control company, were one of the firms that we've drawn some insights from. And they were describing how at their assessment centre, they drove round this food truck loaded with pest-shaped jellies. So you might get a sugar-coated spider or a wobbly cockroach. And they said the candidates loved it. I'm not sure if that would be universal for those that have a kind of arachnophobia, but they said the candidates loved it. It showed we're a bit fun and we can talk about what we do in a fun way. How can we simulate that online? Likewise, Softcat, who are a seller of IT technology, said, well, look, well, the hiring managers were saying, look, how can people get a feel for what it's like to work here? We've got our pool tables, we've got our open spaces at our offices, we've got the fun that we have. How can we tell them about that online? I would say that of all of the concerns about going virtual and all of the challenges that organisations have faced, this is the one that companies have had the most trouble in cracking. What I would like to suggest is that if you have any experience of fun virtual assessment centres, or how you've made them more engaging beyond just being very well designed, pop those in the chat and I'll review those and we'll have a little look at those at the end and see if we've got some good ideas there. Another concern was around fairness. So how do we make sure that people aren't disadvantaged from taking it online? If you come into an office or come into a hotel, then you know that everyone's had the same experience. If they're taking it from home with different internet connections, with different levels of privacy, perhaps different microphone quality, how can we guarantee that fairness? And it hasn't been investigated fully yet, so we're unsure. Also, the assessors themselves, how can we be sure they'll be as fair online as they are face-to-face? How are we sure that they're as comfortable with the technology and therefore are not worrying about that rather than doing their job as assessors? So valid concern. Logistics, I mean, this is a big one. How on earth do we turn that 8-hour face-to-face event into an online experience? What systems shall we use? How do we inform people? What are the IT issues that we could face? How quickly does this need to be brought into effect? So it's logistically daunting. And then assessment. I mean, how do we actually assess people online? So many firms would include a group exercise as part of their face-to-face centre. How do we simulate that online? Is a Zoom call with different windows going to give us the same type of information? Does the scoring system that we've developed for online still work? Also, people were saying, well, look, the job requires going to face-to-face meetings, perhaps, and selling our product to people. How can we simulate that via a phone call or via a video conference if that's not the medium through which they'll actually be conducting these meetings? So obviously, they needed to have one eye on the fact that those sales meetings might be more virtual in future, and in many ways this might be more accurate or more reflective, but there was still concern there. So that's the concerns. Now, let's talk about some of the benefits that these organisations have reported from online assessment centres. So the first, and possibly the most impactful, is diversity, equality and inclusion. And that might strike people as surprising, as that being one of the biggest benefits from going virtual. But let me tell you about what people were saying. So firms are reporting a far greater diversity of people applying, which they put down to accessibility. So people did not need to travel to central London or some part of the country, which involved paying for travel, which involved perhaps taking a day off work. Also, for those that recruit from a global talent pool, They no longer needed to fly people to a physical location. They could do it online. And likewise, in a development setting, you could have global development centres that were truly inclusive. You didn't have one or a couple of people suffering from jet lag as they go through their assessment in some central location. There's some anecdotal stories about candidates who had disabilities. So working through the materials with an assistant for a candidate who had a significant sight-related disability, they reported in the ISE report that they felt they were able to take part to the same degree as everyone else. And also, if you think about some of the more psychological aspects, so people who have social anxiety, agoraphobia, who maybe come along to a face-to-face interview but wouldn't disclose it, but it could have affected their performance or their confidence levels. If they're talking from the comfort of their own home, then that's far better for them. The statistics, again, early days, but nationwide reported a 52 to 48 male to female ratio hiring split once they moved their process online, and their ethnic group differences, they reported a 60 to 40 white to ethnically diverse appointment rate. So it's versus previous years, this was comparable, if not better. Also, if you think about it from the assessor perspective, there are some sources of bias that have been removed. So when you're at a face-to-face assessment centre, it might depend who's reading out the instructions. Do they go fast? Do they go slow? Do they smile? Do they look serious? Do they answer questions willingly? Do they say kind of up to you? Online assessment centres typically mean more consistent administration. There's also that thing around the informal coffee chats that assessors might have, or when they come back into the assessor room, do they talk about candidates? They shouldn't, but sometimes they do. And in an online environment where everyone's separate, that's far less likely to occur. And then finally, if you think about the candidates themselves, there's this idea of stereotype threat, which could hinder candidates' performance. So if they come to an assessment location, they don't see people that look like them there, or they see an environment that's quite daunting. Imagine the first time that you came up those escalators in Canary Wharf and you saw the glass buildings and you kind of looked around. I don't know if I did that the first time I did it. I was pretty in awe of it. But that can interfere with people's cognition, with their flow. So that's removed. They're in the comfort of their own home. Okay, that was a big one. These ones I'll run through a little bit more quickly. So improved attendance rates. So actually attending the assessment centre, many companies experience candidates who just don't turn up. Companies reported leaps in this from around 60 to 90 to 100%, from 50 to 90%. So you're making much more of your assessment time and your assessor's time, and you're getting more people to choose between. Good behaviour, that's a bit of an odd one, but people reported that candidates were adapting well and behaving online. So the example given was around group discussions. So they are letting each other speak, being quite courteous, raising their hands physically or using the icons when they want to interject, which I guess can be at odds with a face-to-face event where you have the person who grabs the flip chart marker, strides up there and says, right team, what are we going to do to improve profitability? So it allowed perhaps more opportunity for people to speak. Time and cost savings, no hotel, no travel, no venue costs. All of that money can be funneled into keeping the candidate warm, or perhaps approaching a well-known assessment design company to create even better bespoke assessments for them. So some sample statistics. So nationwide, we're reporting saving around 508 hours by moving from from face-to-face to virtual. They equated it to about £80,000 worth of savings. Also, because you're not having to rely upon scheduling things, taking into account travel and venue availability, your time to offer can be reduced, so you perhaps have a better choice between candidates. Logistics were a concern when moving to assessment centres, but actually a lot of it's simpler because you're working within an online environment. You're not running around between floors of a building. If someone drops out, especially with a dedicated platform, you can just make that change and it filters through everyone else's timetables. You don't need to go and hand out new paper copies to everyone. You don't need to go and change room labels, etc. So the logistics and flexibility are good. Candidate engagement. Candidate engagement so far seems positive. People are rating it engaging. I think I'll make a caveat about individual differences according to personality type shortly, but on the whole, candidates are reporting that they are enjoying it. The research base is growing. So I mentioned the Corn Ferry report earlier. This involved 168 face-to-face participants compared to 947 virtual participants employed at a global communications company. And they compared how the two different assessment methods worked along a number of different criteria. What their conclusions were that virtual assessments can deliver comparable participant experience. The predictive power is, again, broadly equivalent, and the developmental value gained from these virtual centres are the same for individuals and for organisations. So, I know that of a couple of people in my network that are considering doing a PhD on this very topic. So I would say the research is looking promising, but more research is required, that old chestnut. It's socially responsible. So let's not forget the reason for the move to online in the first place. It was the global pandemic, social distancing, protecting those who are vulnerable, stopping the spread. So that's all good. But also thinking about the carbon footprint. So there's no travelling. There's also fewer trees needing to be chopped down to produce all the paper. So there's a whole range of socially responsible benefits. And then finally, assessor engagement. So there isn't the travel, there isn't the overnight stays for them. They can use their time more productively than travelling between venues. Okay, so those are the benefits. So it sounds really rosy. It makes you think, well, why haven't organisations embraced this sooner? And I think that's true for a lot of those points. I think there are some drawbacks, which I will run through. Security. So a face-to-face centre, candidates generally, we give out the materials and we collect it back in afterwards. They couldn't usually get away with getting a phone out and starting to photograph things. But they can do that online. They can take screenshots, they can take photographs, they can share it online. You could compromise the confidentiality of materials. I guess there is also the risk of someone performing a data breach and getting an access or hacking into the system somehow, or passwords being leaked and people getting access to materials that they shouldn't have. So the security is perhaps harder to control in some ways. Who's actually at the assessment centre? So at a number of assessment centres that I've been involved with, we will ask people for their identification, but also you know that person you see in front of you has truly worked on their tasks in isolation. Now, if you're assessing someone virtually online, then first of all you need to confirm who that person on camera is, and then secondly, how do you know that someone off camera isn't feeding in hints and tips as they're in their preparation time for their meetings? So that's hard to manage. The IT issues, it is complex. Even if you use a tailor-made platform, we found international compatibility issues. We found security issues around whether voice could be enabled in the discussions, etc. And these things, I guess, are often unforeseen. So we'd actually even involved the IT department, and we'd tested the system out on selected people's machines. But even then, on the day, unforeseen things came up. Bandwidth restrictions were put in place, and we needed to move to an alternative plan. So that can be an issue. Also, trying to get the systems talking to each other. So getting the assessment centre talking to the applicant tracking system, where we've got the rest of the candidate data. They don't always talk to one another, especially if you've pieced together your own system from Google Docs and Zoom, etc. Also, internet connections. I mean, this is something that people often poo-poo. They say, "Oh, everyone's got a mobile now. Everyone's fine on that." But that really isn't the case. I mean, there are certain rural communities who have poorer internet connection. There will be parts of buildings or a house where you are further away from the router, and perhaps it's a less strong connection. You will have other people in the household perhaps using your internet at the same time, which reduces it. Internationally, we've had some really quite poor quality internet connections that are not just frustrating for the candidate and the assessor, but they trigger a whole load of biases, because if you're really struggling to hear someone and to follow their train of thought, then that can really trigger biases. Actually, in the ISE report, it did mention that some candidates declined from taking part in the assessment because of the fact they couldn't find suitable conditions in which to take the assessment regarding internet and quiet space, etc. The drawbacks, we've talked about the fun aspect earlier. Hopefully people are putting things in the chat at the moment, but how do you sell the role online? And new assessor biases. So I talked about internet quality, but yes, microphone quality, camera quality. What pictures do they have in the background? I've got a fairly inoffensive picture of some vases, but what happens if that was a Pulp Fiction poster? What happens if that was a I love Donald Trump poster? How could that affect the biases of the observer? Also, interruptions. If I was suddenly interrupted while giving this presentation, could that trigger an inadvertent bias on the part of the audience that think, well, if Ben had really planned out his time, he would have ensured there weren't any interruptions while he was delivering this. Okay, so we've painted the picture enough. We now need to talk about the top tips, and we've categorized these. So tips to ensure that technology runs smoothly, tips to allow candidates to shine, tips to allow assessors to excel, and tips for designing a virtual assessment. Okay, so let's talk about, let's grapple with technology first. It's every psychologist's favorite topic. So here are the key tips that we would offer to ensure the technology runs smoothly. First of all, source a platform, and be aware that not all technology platforms are equal. So some will allow you the ability to have a timetable that assessors and candidates can view. Some will have the ability to draw all that information into a central location for the integration session. Some will integrate video conferencing, but some will be something else in disguise. So it was a piece of technology that was really meant for something else, and it's been jury rigged to do a virtual assessment centre. And what you need to be doing is asking questions about all of the features that you might expect and seeing if that platform does it. Involve IT in the process early. I cannot stress this enough. Even if you're not using a dedicated platform, if you're going to use Zoom, Google Docs, etc., having that number of people accessing that amount of information or that number of calls at the same time, is that going to cause a potentially unforeseen issue? So involve IT from the start. If you're using a third-party platform, get a clear service level agreement in place. So are they going to be available on the day to answer questions? How quickly will they respond to queries? What guarantees do they make about uptime and when maintenance is scheduled for, etc. Check technology works. I mean, this one sounds pretty obvious, but you want to make sure it happens, because you could send people, oh yes, make sure the technology works in advance, but you have to make sure the assessors actually do it, because you don't want to be on the assessment day itself and then someone's saying, my microphone's not working, or I haven't got the link. You want to ensure that everyone does this in advance, especially if you're doing this internationally. You want that clear troubleshooting guide and procedure. What happens if something goes wrong? Here is a step-by-step process. Here's who you consult. Here's the order in which you try things out, and having a named person responsible if that's required. Also, have an emergency plan B. So in the example I gave about the client we work with that had the unforeseen issue with bandwidth on the day that meant we couldn't use the built-in video conferencing platform, our plan B was to use WebEx instead. It was cumbersome and it was a little bit clunky, but it got the job done, and that was our next best option. So make sure you have that clearly written down in advance. You don't want to be winging it on the day. Learn and improve. So ask for feedback that to the technology provider or to the person who's pulling together your own process, and improve. And also consider data protection issues. So make sure you're complying with the international laws relevant to recording people on video, if you're doing that, or data storage. Okay, candidates, how can you help them to shine? So I guess first of all, consider individual differences. So I said earlier that people tend to like virtual assessment centres, and they do. However, not everyone will. For some people, they will find this a source of anxiety, using technology rather than face-to-face to be assessed. They might find it quite a strain spending long periods of time looking at a monitor and being assessed for 8 hours or however long your assessment centre is. So what you want to do is to avoid the unintended consequence of recruiting to type. So saying, well, actually the only people we've ended up attracting and recruiting are those who really enjoyed the online assessment experience. They may well have a certain personality makeup that alters the composition of your team. Okay. Give people access in advance. So again, help them to prepare, make sure it works. Let them have a play so they're not saying, where do I click for help or where do I go for next on the day? They know. Give them lots of information. So tell them the timings. Tell them things like dress code. I mean, you would do that face-to-face, but it's still worth doing that virtually, because one person turns up in their Led Zeppelin t-shirt, another person turns up in a full suit and tie, another person does sports casual, as Alan Partridge would say, then that might trigger certain biases on the assessors that you don't want. So have a dress code still. Tell them what to expect so that it doesn't come as a surprise, so they will be on camera, or they will be in a group exercise online, or whatever it might be. Encourage them to set up their home environment, so no interruption sign, but also reassure them that if they do have, for example, responsibility for children or responsibility for pets, and they do happen to interrupt, reassure them that this will not affect the judgments made at the assessment centre, so they don't get into a panic. Make sure that they're clear how to report technical issues and have that dedicated resource available if they have any issues on the day. Don't forget to sell the role on your company. So again, especially virtually, it's important to try and entice them into your organisation. So how do you do that? Well, with a bespoke assessment centre rather than an off-the-shelf one, you can tell them all of the wonderful stuff that's available at your organisation as part of the candidate brief, and that could be woven into some of the exercises. In the interview, you can ask about what drives them and motivates them. You can then have some competency questions, and you can then say, would it be helpful if I told you a bit about the company and what it's like to work here, and tie that in with what they've said motivates them. So make sure that you sell your organisation as much as possible, rather than just saying, well, we're a big name, we'll just assume they want to work for us. Some companies in the ISE survey reported that icebreakers can be useful, because otherwise you just throw some strangers straight into a Zoom discussion and it can be quite stilted and awkward, even more so than it can be at a face-to-face centre. So icebreakers can be useful to warm people up first. Tips to allow assessors to excel. So I would say keep the assessor technology briefing separate to the briefing where you tell people about the exercises and ORCE, so the observe, record, classify, evaluate methodology. Let them dive into the technology, play with it, break it, or get confused by it, and respond to those questions, and cover assessor training separately, and have a dry run, definitely. Tell them to keep the day job away. So it's much easier on a virtual assessment centre for assessors to have their phone by the side and to be checking emails, or to say, well, actually, I've got a gap in my timetable then, I could have that Zoom call then. Just like a face-to-face centre, they should be focused on what they're doing on that day. So set the out of office, inform their colleagues, don't schedule meetings in and around assessments. And update your unconscious bias training so that they are aware of the new biases that can come online. Tips for designing a virtual assessment. So again, we've talked about this earlier, but despite the benefits of off-the-shelf exercises being quick and being typically already gone through the piloting process and being less upfront investment, bespoke exercises are really going to allow you to sell the company. And as the second point says, don't transpose like for like. So take advantage of the technology, integrate video if you can. That might be a welcome from the CEO. It might be some video briefings as part of the candidate pack for an exercise. I don't know, some people might be aware, but some of the research into situational judgment tests shows that those that include video are not only fairer, but are more predictive than those that are text only. And we would hope to carry forward some of that into the assessment centre environment as well. Think about timetabling. So how the schedule is, not lots of back-to-back meetings where you might get Zoom fatigue. Consider the opportunity to blend in some informal meetings, maybe over lunch, into the timetable. Think about the order of the exercises and the ability to take breaks in between, which in a face-to-face one, you'd have time for people to move between rooms. Here, you might want time for people to jump between Zoom calls or whatever it might be. So space it out. Also, to that point earlier about 8 hours in front of a Zoom call, you might find yourself moving to shorter events. So less taxing in the long term, so 4 hours rather than 8, and choosing those exercises that give you the best bang for your buck in that time period rather than the very long centres. So what next for virtual assessment? What does the future hold, or what do these organisations say the future holds? The majority say that they're going to stay at least hybrid, if not 100% virtual. One client at the in-house recruitment exhibition I went to remarked that you'd have to be bloody mad to go back to face-to-face centres, considering the time and the cost savings involved in virtual, and the improved attendance rates and the feeling that we're making good assessments here. There is this concern still around experience in the office environment. Does this impair people's likelihood to accept a job offer? Overall, organisations felt that it's more important for people to feel personally valued, to feel understood, and feeling like they've got the potential to have a future at the company, that are more important than wowing them with the office environment. And it's felt that those things can be achieved virtually. I think the most important thing about virtual assessment centres is, are they valid predictors? Are they doing what they're supposed to do in a fair way? And to that end, I think this needs to be monitored going forward. So what are the people who've been recruited using these methods going on to doing the job? How long are they staying? How is their performance being rated by managers? What's the adverse impact like? What's the offer acceptance rate like? And obviously there are confounding variables. As the job market changes, that could shift. But I would say that the move to virtual is very much a permanent one for many, but we need to monitor it to make sure that there's no unintended consequences from that. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. We'll move to some Q&A now. Just to say that we do have a virtual assessment centre checklist. Here's one extract here, but it's a multi-page checklist to help make sure that you are as prepared as you can be for your virtual assessment centre. And you can email me at ben@sten10.com to request that. Also, feel free to connect on LinkedIn, etc. And now let's take a look at the chat to see if people have got any recommendations around how to make these virtual assessments more fun and to answer any questions.